You said two things to me, Melissa. When you signed up, I want to talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the question that you posted on the webinar. You said, a lot of my writing lately feels more like work and less like play than it did when I first started. I'm hoping to get back to the inspired playtime feeling without losing what I've learned in the meantime. So tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, I guess I should say I've been writing and working on writing for really a very long time, but jumping around between genres a lot. And I think that what I tend to do is start trying to do a whole new form. And I get really, really excited about experimenting with this whole new form. Right now, I'm working on picture books, children's picture books, and that works really well for me with having little kids around in the house. Always inspired for new ideas and things like that. But once I learn all the rules of a form, I tend to get to a place where I don't I don't like following rules. You know what I mean? And so I'm either writing stories where I break them and I really love what I'm doing, but it's not very marketable, or I'm writing stories where I follow them and I don't love what I'm doing and it sort of looks marketable, but it never really has that spark that catches anyone's attention.
What inspired you to start writing?
I've always written. I have always It's just who I am, I guess.
That's fantastic because that's what you should follow. Exactly that, who you are. The rest of it is just somebody else's idea of what's marketable.
Hmm.
This is the thing that I also said on the webinar. Nobody knows what's going to sell tomorrow. They only know what sold well in the past. Nobody knew that Olivia the Pig was going to be a great success. Certainly nobody knew, except for Ursula Nordstrom, that Morris Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are was going to be as wildly successful as it has been, because there had never been a picture book like that before. One of the things that I'm really trying to do with the way that I'm working with writers, too many writers today are overwhelmed by all these rules and regulations that have somehow sprung up in the last 20 or 25 years, and who's making them up? That to me is one of the things that I think is really stifling every new writer's voice if they go along the kind of track that you've been pursuing. Whereas if I actually ask a writer, well, why did you start writing? Or why are you inspired to write? They almost always come up with an answer like yours. Yours is the true answer. That's what you should really follow, because from that, all of this other stuff that's stopping you, I have to do it this way and then there's no spark in it, or if I do it my own way, it's not going to be marketable. I think all of that will go away. You do have to take the risk if you go completely your own way that it may not be marketable.
I'm ready to take that risk now. I think years ago I was much more, I still very, very definitely want to publish my work, but I've been spending years sort of following the rules and not getting things picked up anyway. And when I think about it, I think I've had enough talks with myself where I realized that if I had a crystal ball and knew that I would never ever have a successfully published book, I would still write. So it's kind of changing what I want to write a little bit, because it seems silly to keep pursuing some kind of approval or something like that I'm not getting anyway. And working on things that aren't quite what I want to be working on. I would much rather just work on what I want to work on. And so that's kind of where I am just emotionally with it right now. If I'm going to spend the time and do the work, which I'm always going to do that. I want it to be really something I really care about.
In order to really write from your voice and from your truth and from the things that really move you to be creative, you have to give up looking for outside approval.
Mhm.
And I think it's harder for women than it is for men. And it's something that's very subtle. I mean, sometimes we know it very obviously, but it's also something that's very subtle. I know for myself, I thought I had really come to grips with this whole outside approval. In fact, I wasn't really even aware so much that I was looking for it. I don't talk about this a lot when I talk with writers, but both of my parents were huge influences on me. My father pioneered post-independence modern art in India, which means he's a very big deal in a certain art market and was an important British painter. My mother was an haute couturier and dressed some of the most fashionable women in Europe during the 60s and 70s. They were both towering figures in my life, as you can imagine, that degree of talent that they both had. They were also immigrants. They left India, went to England, which is not the most friendly country for people with brown skin, and certainly was not at the time that my parents went there, which was a few years after the Second World War had ended. But the thing about them, the reason that they influenced me, was that they never compromised their own vision for anybody. My father just painted exactly what he wanted to paint. Having said that, he was absolutely grounded in craft. He knew every painting technique that it was possible for him to learn. And when he didn't know it, after he'd mastered all of those basic to advanced skills and techniques, he would figure out how to learn them for himself, whatever new thing he wanted to do. And the same with my mother. My mother would turn away clients when they would say, Maria, can you do this or that or the other on my dress? And my mother would say, no, it's not going to go with the dress and it's not going to suit you. And if they threw a little hissy fit, she'd say, fine, go to another designer. It wasn't that she didn't need the money. She needed the money, but she wasn't willing to compromise her own creative integrity. And I think one of the things in writing, more than almost in any other art form, I see writers compromise their creative integrity in order to fit in with the market. And that's one of the reasons why I want to really try and help writers to understand they're not going to be any better off creatively. In fact, they'll be worse off creatively if they do that.
What do you think is the difference between pushing yourself to learn craft, compromising your integrity? Because for most of my life, I think I've thought that I was just pushing myself to learn craft. And I think some of the time I haven't been just doing that. I've been sort of bending to someone else's will instead. I feel that I've crossed that line and I don't quite know where to draw that line. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. First of all, which is something I said in the webinar, craft is absolutely important. We have to learn it. I learned most of my craft from reading great books from an early age, and I suspect you did too. And I suspect a lot of writers actually learned craft that way. The difficulty now is that we have a whole school of classes telling us certain rules and what kind of craft is needed. There's a place where you've been pushing yourself to learn the rules, and then there's been a moment when you feel you compromised your integrity in order to fit yourself into those rules. And right now, you don't quite know exactly where you are, whether you've pushed yourself a little bit too far over the line, and how can you get back to yourself? Is that about what you asked?
Yeah, I think I'm just sort of wondering if you have a way of describing for yourself what the difference is there.
I think in a way you don't have to worry about the differences. You just have to forget about the craft. It's the same thing that I said to a couple of people, or certainly to one person in the webinar. If you know how to drive a car, before you get into that car, when you pick up your car keys, you're not thinking, well, how am I going to drive the car? You just get in and you drive because you've learned how to drive the car. Because if you were busy thinking about how to drive the car, you'd probably have an accident in 5 minutes. So it's the same thing with craft. You know it well enough now that you simply shouldn't think about it. You know, if you have a new form that you want to learn, okay, you're going to go and you're going to see how other people do it. Because you know yourself well enough and you know enough craft from other forms, look at the things that really appeal to you. Look at the books that really appeal to you. Figure out what it is that appeals to you and why it appeals to you, and then apply that to your own work. What you're going to apply is not what that person did, but why what they did really inspires you or makes you think about something that sparks a new idea. If you go to my website and you look under the tab in the menus on writing,
Mm-hmm.
I've picked out, not totally randomly, I mean, they certainly are authors I love, and they are interviews and video clips that I've listened to, and they've inspired me. There's one on there. Well, there are two on there by Marcus Zusak, but one of them is the interview. He gives a shortish interview about the book thief. He says something like, if a ray of light were to come out of the sky tomorrow and tell him that what he's working on now would never see the light of day, that nobody would ever read it, would he still write it? He says his answer is yes, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the writing of it that's important to him and playing with language. When we don't know any rules at all, everything goes. The more and more we develop and mature in our writing, which does involve learning the craft, whatever that means to us, we become aware of that. And it does take away that sense of almost ignorance is bliss, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
childhood innocence from our work. But it should also still be enjoyable. I mean, I know I answered you and I said, well, writing is work and good writing is difficult to do. But I'm never depressed really when I'm writing. If I'm depressed, I'm depressed, but it's not to do with the writing. And I write from a place of really just loving the fact of being able to write. I'm listening to the Brothers Karamazov at the moment, and suddenly an idea, an image came into my head for one of the pieces of writing I'm working on. I just stopped and I wrote it down. I just thought, wow, I really like this. I don't know whether it will end up in the story or not, but I really enjoyed that 15, 20 minutes, whatever it took me to write out the whole thing. And I was thinking about you and I thought, well, I didn't say to you, writing is supposed to be enjoyable. It's not just supposed to be some big grind, otherwise why do it? But there is also effort in it. The whole notion of the 3-act structure that some people break into a 4-act structure, well, into a 3-act structure with 2 parts, so 4 sections. For a novel, it's a false structure. It doesn't actually belong in the novel. There is no great writer who has ever sat down and said, now I'm going to follow a 3-act structure. First of all, the 3-act structure, it originally comes from Aristotle, which wasn't a 3-act structure. It was actually a 5-act structure based on the Greek tragedies that had ended before Aristotle was born. You'll hear an editor like Cheryl Klein talk about the Aristotelian plot. And what she's really referring to is inciting action, rising action, climax, falling out, denouement, and the ending. A German dramaturg by the name of Gustav Freytag came along, and he decided that he wanted to study Greek tragedy and the 5-act structure of Shakespeare in order to make this model. So the model that Cheryl Klein is actually using, as far as I can see, and that a lot of people are using, is in fact Gustav Freytag's pyramid model, which does those stages that I've just described. When Freytag came up with that model, he wasn't thinking of the novel. In fact, he had a different structure for the novel, but we don't know what it is because he didn't complete it. So that was for plays because we didn't have film at that time. Up until the 19th century, plays and drama follow the Aristotelian model, which they took from the Poetics and also from Freytag. But then a new kind of playwriting starts to happen to reflect the ideas of social realism, and the Aristotelian model is discarded. And then, of course, you come to the 20th century and everything breaks out. Then we get film. Now, film, of course, needed some structure after it moved from silent films into talking films and eventually into the kind of narratives that they are. And people started going back to Aristotle and started going back to Freytag and using that pyramid model in order to structure a film script. And Hollywood picked up on that. And then you've got something like Save the Cat, which is a great book to read. But all of a sudden, all of that is being translated or transferred over into the novel, which is a completely different format. A novel and a play and a film are simply not the same thing, and so you cannot use the same structure. If you open up a Jane Austen novel and you apply the rules for a 3-act structure, you're going to find that you can apply them. But she wasn't sitting there thinking about that. So I know that's been a bit of a diversion that I went into, but I think it's really important for writers to understand, writers of novel, to actually understand that this 3-act structure that's being imposed on them and on their work is not true to the form in which they're trying to write. And I have really struggled with that because my background is theatre, so I understand the 3-act structure like the back of my hand. But I find it difficult to conceptually apply it because it doesn't make sense and it's not really how novels work. If you follow your writer's voice, you will find, and if you have enough craft, which I know you do, but you just let it all go, you will find naturally that your story will follow the exact arc that it needs to follow and may be able to correlate with Freytag's pyramid.
When I write something new, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about and writing down why it excites me or what my vision is for it before I start showing it to people, because that helps me hang on to my vision for it even after I start hearing criticism and hearing ideas from other people about what should change. And I think that was a good point because you suggested that I do something similar when I read things that I love. And I think that's a good idea.
It's certainly the thing that I do. And it's not just when I'm reading fiction. Often actually when I'm reading nonfiction, there will be things that inspire me for something I'm writing about in fiction. And if I can, I immediately make a note of that, whatever that is, whatever that association and that idea is, I make a note of that. The thing I would say about showing your work to other people, and this is something that I discovered for myself, I came to all of these classes very late. Like you, I more or less knew that writing was my one true talent or strength or gift, whatever you want to call it, that I had from a very early age. But then I took this detour into theatre. But I had always written. And then when I came back to writing, by the time I came back to writing, there were all these classes and people said, oh, you have to go and do this class, you have to go and do that class, you have to learn how to write a novel this way and that way. And I thought, okay, I mean, who am I to say that's not the way that I thought it had to be? So I went and I felt for a very long time like a square peg in a round hole. And then, as I said earlier, I always had this problem with the 3-act structure, trying to convert what I know about it into the novel form. But then, of course, the classes that I was in, you had to post work and have it critiqued and so on. And I was in one class that was a year-long novel structure class. And then people were giving me feedback, and I realized I became very defensive. And then I had to figure out why I felt so defensive. And eventually I realized I was getting feedback far too early.
Yeah.
You know, that was the thing. I hadn't got to the point where I could look at my work and say, I have now said everything exactly the way that I want to say it. Once I figured that out, my life became incredibly easy in terms of feedback. Now I just don't show my work to anybody at all, not even my favorite person, who is not a writer. She's a ceramicist. She's a great editor, but she's a great editor in a micromanaging way too, which is fine when I've finished my work. But it's not so fine when she's trying to give me feedback or ideas. And she's very gentle about it, but still,
Mhm.
it makes me still feel, if it's too early, that kind of defensiveness. And I think that defensiveness is a very good thing because it's your voice telling you, no, this person is actually interfering with my thoughts that I haven't completely been able to articulate yet, or I haven't articulated it yet. It's not the other person's fault because we showed them the work. So
Mhm.
we have to be protective of our work in that sense. As soon as I'm at that point, I literally can take criticism from anybody. I mean, I'm talking reasonable criticism, not horribly negative criticism that doesn't go anywhere. And that I just try to ignore. It's hard to ignore it because it's just not nice when anybody is nasty about something. But in terms of people who genuinely want to help me, at that point, I am completely open to everything that they're going to say to me. And I know for myself, if they say something to me and it resonates and I say, oh, yes, okay, that's good. I'm going to think about that. I don't think how they're telling me to change it, how to do it, is necessarily the way I want to do it. But if they say, this isn't working for me because of I don't feel whatever, I listen to that. My micromanaging friend will sometimes even say to me, what about this word instead of that word? And I am very particular about how I write. I listen for rhythm, I listen for cadence, how words lie one next to the other visually is very important to me. How the letters are, very important. All of those things. They aren't things I think about at the beginning, although some of it's there at the beginning just because it's so ingrained in me in a certain way. And I think it's really there for every writer. I was never asked to focus on my voice, but I just inherently knew from my parents and the way that they worked with their talents that somehow voice, although I would never have caught it that when I was a child, I wouldn't have known that, was the most important thing to follow. That inner voice of whatever it is that makes you create. And then I'm just very open with people. And I can make that decision very easily. People will say, well, we think this or that. And sometimes I say yes, and sometimes I say, well, no, that's not what I want. And then I just move on. I never think, am I writing this for the market? I mean,
Mhm.
I do think that in some way because I think it's impossible not to have that idea somewhere in the back of your head because it's so out there and we can't be
Right.
separate from whatever is in culture and within the writing culture at the moment. But in another way, I don't follow that voice is what I'm saying. I don't
Mhm.
let that voice dictate what I really believe in a way, I think the short answer for you in terms of your integrity question is exactly what you're doing now, which is to not put anything out until you absolutely know that you're not going to be shaken by what anybody else says. Until you
Mhm.
can get to that point in a certain way, it's going to be hard. Not just you, but for any writer. We have to get to a point where even if whoever your favorite editor in the entire world is, in the publishing world, were to come to you and say, Melissa, I really love this story, but you need to change A, B, C, D, E, which I doubt that they would say it in that way if we're talking about the really great editors, of which we seem to have fewer and fewer, unfortunately, but that is the way of the world at the moment. You have to know that if it's important to you, you need to say, I hear you, but this is important to me. And then they're either going to say to you, then we're going to make this work, or they're going to say, sorry, we're not going to publish your book. And you have to live with the second thing. You have to know that the second thing.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm thinking of Rowling actually at the moment. Her first book was actually longer than it ended up published. And there were things that they wanted to cut. And one of those things was the troll scene. And she said, absolutely not.
Right.
And that was right at the beginning when nobody thought she was going to be successful, when Bloomsbury bought the book. So the second thing that you said was, you said, one thing that jumped out at me was the discussion of following what you know is true or right about the story and forgetting everything else. There's a book I've been trying to write for 10 years. But what I really have is a world and not a story. I often have moments when I think I know what I want that story to be. I get lit up and follow my ideas for a while, sometimes just for a day, sometimes for months. And then later, for whatever reason, I decide that what I wrote in the heat of that inspiration was all wrong. I go back and revise it until I don't see any path forward anymore. I end up in the weeds, just trying to slog through until I have another spark of inspiration that burns and dies the same way. I'm not sure how to end this pattern and find the real story. Thoughts? Well, because I feel like you should be writing this to an agony aunt. Please
Yeah,
help me.
it's funny.
Yes, go.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
that's a book that I'm not really actively working on right now, just because I find writing a novel takes so much sustained attention that I just don't have when I have a baby.
Right.
um,
No, exactly.
and so I've set that project aside for the time being until I feel like I can dedicate blocks of time and keep sustained attention over weeks on end. But the discussion of voice in the webinar just brought that whole project to mind. I mean, I think a lot of what we've just talked about has actually kind of clarified that for me. I know that some of the things that I did before as a sort of a younger writer, write the first 15 pages and then go rush out to a critique situation with 15 pages and no real clear idea of what was coming next, and get all this feedback and go backwards, and that's, I think, something that was a pattern of mine in the past that I won't be at risk of doing in the future, because I've learned since then that it's not the right path for me to get feedback just as I go before I've figured out what the whole story is, before I actually have a draft and a sense of where I'm going. But I just have a tendency to lose faith that what I'm doing is really what I want to be doing. It's definitely a pattern for me that I get excited about a story and push myself to work on it, and then at some point, I don't know, I'm just looking at it and I go, oh, this isn't at all what I want it to be, and that's when I kind of tend to crash and burn. I have just losing faith partway through is very definitely something I think I would struggle with no matter what, even if I weren't getting feedback too early.
So you have this great idea and it inspires you to actually start writing. And writing. And for quite a while, you feel, oh, I'm following this great idea that I've had, that it's sort of fueling you like a sunburst in a way. And then
Right.
you get to a point, and suddenly it's as if somebody has taken away the sun. And you think, what the hell am I doing? This isn't at all what I imagined or what I wanted or whatever. Tell me, if you can, how that second part comes about or why it comes about.
I think maybe I'm just not staying inside the idea, inside the project, that I'm thinking from the outside about making it like a complete novel. When I'm working, I tend to jump around. I might write the same scene a couple of different times because I'm just inspired to without looking at the previous one. It's a really messy process, and I think I get overwhelmed by that mess. Like, I start looking at it as a product instead of as just an act of creation. I don't know what to call it instead of that.
Right.
But it becomes kind of terrifying to think about taking this huge mess and making it something that other people can read.
So, I mean, it's interesting. I mentioned Susanna Clarke,
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Strange, and Mr. Norrell on the last webinar to somebody who said she had a complicated ending. Susanna Clarke took 10 years to write that book. And
Mm-hmm.
she worked very much the way that you work. And I actually work very much the way that you work. I very rarely work from beginning to end as I'm drafting out my ideas. I'm telling you this so that you know that you're not alone in this way of working. I think there are
Hmm.
many writers who work this way. And I think it's one of the problems of classes. I mean, I don't mean to be negative about classes because there are some fantastic teachers out there. And certainly anybody who wants to learn plot, as I said in my webinar before, I would send them to someone like Mary Buckham because she's just an amazing teacher and she can help any writer with plot more than any other instructor I've been with, and I've been with a number of them. That said, let's assume that that we know plot in terms of that it needs a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it needs dramatic things to happen in order for the story to move forward. A big criticism of Susanna Clarke's book has been by writers I thought would love it. It's a bit like watching paint dry. It just all seems so slow. But if you take her on her own terms, she's not really slow. She's just taking her time to unwind, in my experience of her book, an incredibly elaborate, extraordinary story that involves multiple characters and multiple storylines. So she took about 10 years to write this book. And she would do it the way that you're talking about, where she would write it in fragments, and then she had all these footnotes that were primarily for herself because she'd become interested in certain things and then go off and do research on them and then write a whole footnote for herself. But in that footnote also included fairy stories that seemed to be attractive to her at that moment, mostly from traditional English folklore. Then, of course, she had like this big pile. I read an interview somewhere. I have to try and find that interview again, where she had decided that she put everything onto index cards, the scenes and what they contain. She had it all spread out over the floor. And then she realized that she actually became completely overwhelmed by the whole thing and she couldn't really do it by herself. She was fortunate in that her partner was very close with Neil Gaiman and had sent off a short story she had written, which is how she met her partner. She went to do a workshop with him. The short story, Gaiman just thought was basically flawless, which when you listen to her writing, I think it is more or less flawless. If you like her kind of writing, I mean, if you don't, you're going to think it's boring. Within what she's trying to do, there is such a continuity from word to word, sentence to sentence. There's just this amazing flow that actually happens. So Gaiman spoke to some editors, and then eventually they said, okay, let's go to this editor. Her agent introduced her to an editor, I think. And whoever she worked with at Bloomsbury helped her to sort out this massive amount of material that was fragmented. But she had an overall sense of the story. She knew where the whole story was going. And of course, she had big sections of it written out. But some of it was structuring it and what order it had to come in and maybe what had to get lost and what could remain. And that just needed an outsider. So I think that's something worth keeping in mind for yourself at some point. I think it's a mistake to show one's work, even when one is completely ready with it, to a whole bunch of people at the same time. I think that one needs to really find one person and show the work to that one person first, see what the feedback is, and then spread it out a little bit. I think there's such a push right now for people to have critique groups and to have lots of different people looking at their work. And it's a bit like trying to build an elephant by committee. Everybody's going to have a different opinion about what's working in your work and what isn't working in your work and why it isn't and why it is and what they like and what they don't like. And maybe you'll get some people who come together and will be able to say, this really doesn't work for me, or this really does work for me. One of the writers at Savvy had, I don't know how many people looking at her work. At one point, like 20 people. And it completely destroyed her voice because they were all busy telling her different things and applying whatever they understood about craft rules onto her work. And then it becomes very complicated because then your own trust is broken for yourself.
Right.
And the most important thing that a writer can have is faith in themselves and trust in themselves because there isn't anything outside. If you're a musician, I used this analogy before, but I think it's true. If you're a musician, you have good pitch, and even if you don't have perfect pitch, and you know when your music is off and when it's not off. And often you are playing with other people, and so there is this sense of collaboration and ensemble. But for a writer, it is, regardless of being in groups and classes and everything else, it is a solitary act. And because it is solitary, it means we have to trust ourselves more than we trust anybody else, even our most favorite editor and writing critique partner. We have to deeply develop that trust without it being arrogant, without it being egotistical, but absolutely know this is truly who I am. The words that I'm putting down on the page, they are exactly the words that I want. And when we can do that, then we can have people come in and critique, and then this sense of being overwhelmed in a certain way by our own messy process, I think will dissipate a little bit because we'll know what kind of help to ask for. Because there's nothing wrong with your process. And I think that may be part of what your question was about your story that you've been working on for a number of years. Underneath all of that was, is there something wrong with the way I'm working? And I'm going to say, no, there isn't. You can never say that somebody's way of working is wrong because we don't know how the creative process really works in another person. And we don't know often we don't know how the creative process works in us because the creative process itself doesn't know that. If it knew that, it wouldn't be original. The originality comes in the very moment of working. I think that's why a lot of people say, write every day, and it doesn't really matter what you write as long as you do it every day. I don't necessarily think that's right for everybody. It doesn't necessarily work for everybody. I think it's a good idea if you're a beginning writer. But with a mature writer like you, and especially now, of course, because you have the baby and the other little one, it will be harder for you. But you can still hopefully think a little bit about your writing in between. What is it about that world that inspires you to keep thinking about it 10 years later?
Oh, God, everything.
Everything.
It's just, yeah.
That's fantastic, though. If it's everything, then that's fantastic. Then you should find, even with the baby, you don't have to put a lot of serious work into this. But if it's everything, because as soon as you said that, I think something in you lit up, and so there's something very important for you about that world. Whatever that idea in that world is, keep it somewhere in the back of your mind. And just, as I said in my reply to you, don't, if you end up writing things down about it, just don't edit them. Just put them away somewhere for now. But if it's everything, then, then that means that there's something very important.
Yeah, it is for me.
Why do you think there isn't a story yet?
I don't know. Honestly, I think in some ways it made sense that I pursued poetry first, because stories, though I love reading them, they're not, plot and things like that really aren't what come naturally to me about writing. I get really in love with themes and with kind of all the sort of micro stuff, but spinning an entire large scale project has always been definitely very challenging for me. And so I think that's part of it. It's that I go following the details. And then part of it, I think, is that I was just trying to write something that would fit into the market. And I think that the last year or so, since I have sort of said to myself, let's, pursue something else and just let this be in the back of my mind. I mean, I'm finding myself following different characters in my head. And I think there's going to be a different story there. But I'm really, it's just going to take a while to grow or something.
Within the same world.
Yeah, it's the same world. It's some of the same characters. It's just I think that I'm going to have a different main character than I thought, and a whole different story than I thought, which is perfectly fine. I'm kind of excited about the story that I don't know what it is.
The thing that seems to have excited you was the world.
Yeah, yeah.
So in a certain way, here's one way to think about this.
Mm-hmm.
Because the world is the thing that is everything to you, the world has a story to tell you. Do you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
As opposed to you trying to make a story to fit into that world.
I think that's probably exactly right. Yeah.
Because the thing that really inspires us is the driving thing, whatever that is, however that seed begins. The other thing I was going to say was that in that initial moment of inspiration, this is something I've thought about a lot for myself, because I've tried to understand it, and because I realized there was always a feeling about it. You know, when you get that flash of inspiration, the way that you got this flash of inspiration about this world, and it made you really excited, so excited about it it meant so much to you in a certain way that you're still thinking about it 10 years later. The same way that Rowling, when Harry Potter, sprang into her mind on that train, she just felt, oh, I'd love to write about this, when that whole world sort of flooded in. She had a character as well. But I thought about that moment when we get that moment of inspiration. It has always felt to me that in that moment, it's like a hologram, and it's actually the seed of the entire thing itself. If I'm patient enough, it starts to open up and show itself, but not the way that I always expect it to. In fact, rarely the way that I expect it to. Just like you, maybe those initial ideas and stories don't completely go anywhere, but that inspiration is still there. I don't know if there's anything else that we really need to speak about.
I think I think you've given me a lot of great stuff to think about. But yeah, I feel like this was really, really helpful. So I really thank you very much
Oh,
for
you're very welcome.
taking the time.
You're very welcome. All right, and keep me posted as to how everything's going.
I will. Absolutely.